We'd like to thank Lou Ormont and his family for endowing this lecture. Lou is the founder of the Center for Group Studies, and many of us have trained there. He contributed to the field of group psychotherapy for many decades, 4 or 5 decades at least, was a prolific writer, and highly influenced my own career as a group therapist, my own training. I thought I would just share one, you know how we have these one-liners from our mentors. And what I remember Lou saying once is he quoted Freud in his own way as saying that Freud said that if we're in the future, we'll be anxious, and if we're in the past, we'll be depressed. And what that leaves is this moment. So I invite all of you to be in the moment as we listen to the lecture today by Dr. Nitsun, and would like to welcome you on behalf of the Group Foundation and the Ormont Scholarship, or endowment. It's not a scholarship, so thank you.
Good morning. My name is Andy Poyman, and I am the open session co-chair, one of them. On behalf of our committee and AGPA, I'd like to welcome you here today. As per the rules, we have rules here at AGPA, as we all know, and I appreciate everybody being here at 9 o'clock, because I know some of you have a rule never to get up this early and that you're willing to come to hear this presentation today, so thank you very much. The title of this lecture today is Reflections on Art in Life Through Dolls, the Power of Visual Images to Evoke Personal and Social Themes. The course objectives are: one is to describe the coming together of the presenter's 2 main professional journeys, access the significance of dolls in children's development, differentiate the range of responses to the doll paintings, evaluate the influence of gender on relationship to dolls in response in the exhibition, propose ways in which visual images could be used to explore exploration in a group, suggest advantages to bridging 2 professional activities such as psychotherapy and art, and assess the influence of social constructs on human development. So I want to remind people today too that this is an open session, and we'd like to hear your questions and your thoughts of following Dr. Nitsun's presentation, but just to remind you that it's not confidential. This is going to be a videotape versus an audio tape. I'm very excited to be here. You know, art, for a lot of us mental health professionals, you know, we pay attention to art. We have the house tree person test, we have the kinetic family drawing, we have the Loney draw card test, which probably many of you are not familiar with, and we have the Rorschach, which has historically been a major instrument of projection in some ways. Few people know this, that the ink blots were drawn. Herman Rorschach's father was an artist, and he wanted to be an artist. He ended up being a psychiatrist. And so the stereotype is that you just make those blots and open it up, and that's how you got them. But he painted each individual blot. So art has become a very important part of psychology. Has been, and the Rorschach in my case, has been an important part of my professional life. So today we're going to have a marriage of art and the wonderful art of Dr. Nitsun, who's also a professional artist. And we're also going to have that marriage and the marriage of group psychotherapy. Dr. Nitsun is a psychotherapist, a psychologist, a group analyst, and an artist. And we're going to have a chance to hear from him today. He has a high profile in the world, in all those worlds, in the psychology world, in the psychotherapy world, and in the artist world. He's been a keynote speaker at AGPA. He's, in 2015, he won the Presidential Award for the Royal Academy of Psychiatry in London. He's done work in the National Health System and private practice I could go on, but that would be kind of lame, especially given he has so much to say and we have so little time. So let's put our hands together in a round warm of applause for our Dr. Nitsun. Hope that was okay. Yeah.
Good morning. Just to give you a preview, my presentation is divided into 3 parts. For about an hour or until 11 o'clock, I'll be talking, but with time for discussion. And I'd like you to feel free to interrupt and ask any questions. I'm aware that several of you are exhausted from your wild dancing last night. Someone's put up his hand, yeah. And so it may be, there's a lot of material, visual material, and commentary on the material, and the insights I gleaned from the material. So I don't want to overwhelm you, and if it helps you, please do interrupt and find out whatever you need to find out. And following that, I'll be running a small group with volunteers from the audience. I'll be asking 8 people to come forward, and I'll explain the purpose of the small group later on. It's not a demo group in the usual fashion. It'll be more a small facilitated group on the theme that I'm presenting today. And then there'll be probably about 20 minutes for discussion with the audience. And then Andy has reminded me that objectives are crucial at AGPA, and we need to make time for those. That's the frame within which I'm talking. I'm very grateful to AGPA for giving me this opportunity to share an important moment in my journey as a psychotherapist and artist. It's really the first time that these 2 paths have come together in any significant way. My presentation today is more personal and exploratory than I believe is common in a lecture format of this kind. And I had some misgivings about whether it fits the frame. However, I was reminded by my friend Ronnie Levine, who's with us today, that Louis Ormont was himself an artist in the broad sense before he became a psychotherapist. He had been a playwright and apparently brought a creative, imaginative spirit to his work. And I'm honored to be giving this lecture in his name. I've had a 50-year career, at least 50 years, as a psychologist, psychotherapist, and group analyst. In fact, I've stopped counting because it seems to be going on forever and ever. But throughout this time, and indeed for some years earlier, before I became a psychologist, I have painted seriously with a strong ambition to be an artist. This goes back to my youth in South Africa, my country of origin, and continued in London, where I have lived most of my adult life. The particular focus of my talk today is an exhibition of paintings based on vintage dolls that took place in May 2019 in Brighton on the south coast of England. The subject of the exhibition was a significant departure for me. I had until then painted mainly landscapes, seascapes, and still life, and had become quite well known and, dare I say, quite well regarded for this work. And I'm going to show you some examples of my previous work. That painting is called Cape Point, and it's a triptych of that shows the southernmost part of South Africa, which I thought might be interesting to you since that's the continent I come from. In fact, it's at the very tip of Africa. You can go no further than Cape Point. Here's a different one. Hang on. Yeah, that's a boat in the wind. I did quite a lot of studies of boats, sometimes in calm seas, sometimes in rough seas. That's a triptych of a lily, the flower, the lily. As you can see, my work has quite often verged on abstraction. And then finally, this is actually an earlier work, but I thought I'd show it because I was very influenced by a French-Russian artist called Nicolas de Stael. Has anyone heard of him? A very good artist who died in the 50s, and I was influenced for about 20 years by his work. I still am, to a large extent, influenced. So, there was a question. Oh yes, this is a hilltop town in Italy. So there's a question about the change. Why did I change? Many people on arriving at the exhibition asked, why dolls? They seemed amazed. The truth is that I wasn't sure myself, but the reason I gave was that I had bought a Victorian house in Brighton, which kindled a strong interest in Victoriana. I don't know if anyone's been to Brighton, but you may know that there are lots of antique shops, and particularly Victorian antiques. And I was kind of looking around, rummaging around, buying furniture for the house, etc. And the image of dolls came to me. And I became quite transfixed by this. And the Victorians were themselves very interested in dolls. And I'll show you a photograph of a typical photograph of a child with her doll in the Victorian era. I think it's interesting to see the clothes they wear. There's a kind of similarity between them, almost as if they mirror each other in some way. Also something about the child's kind of parental loving, and yet I'm not sure what that little finger is about, whether it's scolding or you be a good girl, she seems to be saying. Okay. In addition to that, I had begun to feel that I was in danger of repetition with my well-tried and well-liked landscapes in particular. I wanted a new challenge in my painting, and I felt inclined to return to figurative work, which is where I started as in South Africa when I first started painting. As this exhibition progressed, and with the impact of the surprising and often intense responses to the paintings, I realized that there were probably deeper motivations in my producing this work, and it became a kind of journey of self-discovery, and I'll talk about that later this morning. The exhibition was part of the annual Brighton and Hove Artists' Open Houses, and it took place in the studio of my own home. This made it accessible to a wide range of visitors, and this was probably one of the reasons for the very diverse responses to the paintings. I would not have written this paper had I not been struck, at times shocked, bewildered, and disturbed by some of the responses. I was also delighted and at times deeply touched by people's stories. The exhibition culminated in a large group of mainly psychotherapists that I convened in my studio, surrounded by the paintings, for the specific purpose of discussing their impact. As my talk proceeds, I will describe both the general public's response and the group of therapists' response, highlighting some similarities and differences. Most viewers' responses were expressed in personal ways, emanating from childhood experience and memories, as well as current associations. But they also touched on wider social contexts, reflecting what I refer to as the discourse of childhood. Constructs that are partly conscious and partly unconscious. These constructs are seen as formative in influencing the child's developing identity and the role that he or she comes to play in the family and wider society. This leads into the area of the social unconscious, which is a theme that group analysts in Europe are particularly interested in. And the social unconscious can be defined in terms of the existence of social, cultural, and communicational arrangements of which people are unaware or repressed. And I suggest as a background to my talk that the doll paintings are emblems of the discourse of childhood and that they reflect wider social processes that I can only touch on in this talk. Before showing you some of the paintings, it is useful to consider the significance of dolls in childhood development. Dolls are part of the magical world of toys, but with the added significance of their resemblance to human beings. They act as a bridge between the child and the world, animate and inanimate, fantasy and reality, rather like transitional objects in Winnicott's terms. They may represent the child itself, but they're also objects of projection. They can be anything you wish, friends, siblings. Children often treat them as their own baby, like that picture we saw. With them, you can experiment with a host of different relationships. They can be good objects or bad objects, there to be loved and adored, or reviled and rejected. They provide a stage for rehearsing the social and interpersonal challenges that arise in the child's present life and beckon in the future. In Coates' terms, they are self-objects. They offer psychological functions that are germane to development, such as mirroring, twinship, and agency. In order to pursue my subject, I researched dolls extensively online, and I was astonished to find an overwhelming number and variety. Dolls of different countries, cultures, eras, English vintage dolls, French dolls, German dolls, Russian dolls, American dolls, tiny dolls, huge dolls, plain dolls, impossibly glamorous and ornate dolls. Mostly these were girl dolls, but there were also boy dolls. And each of my paintings was taken from sometimes one, sometimes more images. I used the images as a starting point for the paintings. And by the time of the exhibition, I had produced almost 40 paintings on this theme in under a year, which is quite a big output, and I think shows the degree of almost obsession I had at the time. When titling the paintings, I decided to name them individually, to personify them in a way that reflected the source of the inspiration, whether English or foreign dolls such as French and Russian. I sometimes also tried to bring in the Victorian aspect in the names I gave them. And so I'm going to introduce you to some of these dolls, and I'll give you their names as well. So here we have Martha. We have a Martha in the audience who's very amused by this. In fact, if I may tell people the story, that Chaim Weinberg was in the group of therapists who met in my studio. John Schlapobersky was as well. And Chaim told me afterwards that he had took a picture of Martha and showed his wife Martha, and I think asked you if you liked it or wanted to be like Martha, and you said no. Something like that. So let's move on from Martha. This is Felicia, who, as you can see, has a very big hat. This is Angelica, who's holding a kind of muff in her hands. This is Glenn. The next one is Simone, also wearing a big hat. You know, that was the fashion of the day in Victorian times. I'm sure you all have family photographs with women wearing enormous hats. One sometimes wonders how they could survive under the weight of these hats. So there's poor Simone with her very big hat. Now that's Alexandra, and what's interesting about her is that she was based on a series of Russian dolls at the turn of the century who were either the dolls of aristocrats or they were like aristocrats themselves. And there are dolls who are adult, sort of adult dolls, not just child dolls. And so I painted Alexandra in the spirit of the Russian aristocracy. That's Rupert. Rupert was from a photograph I saw of a studio photograph of a little boy in England, also I think at the turn of the century. And now Liliana, can you see her headdress, what she's wearing? This is also, she's a Russian doll, and there was a whole series of Russian dolls based on the ballet, the Bolshoi ballet. And they all wore, the dolls were made to wear these elaborate sort of dancing ballet dresses and these headdresses. So I thought this was really quite intriguing, and I drew the swan. The swan, which no doubt is from Swan Lake, gave that to Liliana. And then I think there's one more at this point. Yes, that is Alistair. Also, actually, I don't know why I called him Alistair, because it was taken from a photograph of an Austrian boy, and I've given him a very English name, so I think I must have gotten my cultures mixed up. But anyway, there he is. Now, looking at the dolls, you probably notice that there is a high degree of ambiguity in the images. The paintings could be perceived as both dolls and children, and some are more ambiguous than others. They could be real or unreal, human or inhuman. And this was partly conscious on my part. I wanted to paint more interesting, challenging images than just pretty stereotyped dolls. The result was that not only that most of the images were ambiguous, but some people felt unnerved by the ambiguity. And there's a term that's used currently quite a lot called the uncanny valley. I don't know if anyone has heard of this term, but it describes the disturbance created by stimuli that hover somewhere between human and inhuman. And when figures resemble human beings, but imperfectly so, this provokes a sense of eeriness and anxiety in the observer, hence the term uncanny. And the valley, as far as I can make out, refers to the dip that occurs in the observer's engagement with the image when they're disturbed in some way by the image. What I found in the exhibition was that people reacted very differently to this uncanny valley. There were some people who were not fazed at all, even enjoying the ambiguity, welcoming it, and others found it unbearable. They just couldn't look at the paintings. They were so kind of thrown by the uncanny valley. Okay, the face. I'm not sure what you related to most in the paintings, but I imagine that what struck you were the faces. And I want to say a bit more about the face. The bodies of dolls are usually obscured by their clothes, their dresses, and other accoutrements concealing their rubbery nakedness. But the face and hair are always prominent and visible, and it's the doll's face more than anything else that defines its personality. And when painting, I was aware of concentrating on the face. So in a sense, these could be seen as portraits of inanimate dolls, but with the potential to come alive, to be characters, to have a story. As you know, the face features significantly in developmental studies and psychoanalytic treatises on infant and child development. I do not have time to go into this, but want to remind you of Winnicott's famous question: what does the baby see when he looks at his mother's face? I'm suggesting that ordinarily what the baby sees is himself or herself. And I suggest we could reverse Winnicott's statement by saying, what does the mother see when she looks at the baby's face? What she sees is herself. And I emphasize this because mirroring is always reciprocal and a lifelong medium of communication. The two processes that were uppermost in people's interpretations of my paintings were mirroring and projection. I've mentioned mirroring, and I'll talk about projection in some detail a bit later on. Now, closely linked to the face is the gaze. And a fairly common reaction to the paintings was the feeling that the dolls were looking at the viewer. Several people referred to the dolls' gaze. They felt that the dolls were inviting them into a conversation of some sort, appealing to them, confronting them, challenging them. One viewer suggested the exhibition be called The Gaze. For her, this was positive. She felt mesmerized by the doll's eyes, strongly drawn into a conversation with them. Each one, she felt, had a different gaze and invited a different conversation. And this contrasted markedly with viewers who hurried past the painting, hardly engaging at all, and for them the gaze seemed to be uninviting, even aversive. So I want to move on from there to a somewhat more detailed account of the responses to the paintings. For some time over the weeks of the exhibition, I was bewildered by the variety of responses. They seemed so different, even opposite to each other. But I gradually realized that there were some common themes and that these could be grouped together. I usually steer away from oversimplified classifications, but I really felt that the responses could be put into these three main categories: the loved or lovely doll or child, the monstrous doll or child, the vulnerable, traumatized doll or child. It was the consistency of these themes, the way they came up repeatedly, that made me begin to see that these were not just personal. They appeared to share constructs of childhood. As I suggested earlier, these are probably socially based and reflect the discourse of childhood. I want to start with focusing on one person's complex responses to the first painting in the show. Now, I do describe several people's responses in a bit of detail, and I asked each person's permission for this. Everyone seemed very happy for me to present their material. And this is someone who actually, through the exhibition, became a very good friend of mine. The response, this particular painting, I think it's this painting, is of a little girl, of a girl holding a teddy bear. And as you can see, the girl is painted very vaguely, and she's not quite there, she's in the background, whereas the teddy bear is painted strongly and very vividly. So the teddy bear has more of a presence than the child has. And when this person saw the painting, she was very struck by this. What she responded to, she is a psychotherapist who specializes in working with adults who have been traumatized as children by being sent to a British boarding school. And you may be aware that there's a growing body of evidence that the experience of going to boarding school can be emotionally damaging, often very damaging to children. It constitutes for these children a traumatic separation from parents and family, of suddenly being thrust into a lonely, uncaring environment with other children in a similar predicament. She was very affected by this painting. She told me afterwards that the image had stayed with her for weeks, triggering memories of her own experience as a child sent from India, where her father was a diplomat, to a boarding school in England. She felt that the shadowy depiction of the child represented exactly how a boarding school child might feel, neglected, unseen, uncared for, and how the vivid teddy bear represented the strong attachment to aspects of home, the child's parents, siblings, toys, that were sacrificed in the transition to boarding school. For these children, toys, dolls, and so on, teddies, have a special significance of attachment significance as objects of attachment and comfort. Vladimir Volkan, who has written a great deal on trauma, uses the term linking objects to describe a person or an object that represents a particular connection with a traumatic past. And it can be a positive or a negative connection. The teddy here seems to be such a linking object. That's how my friend described it. So just going through the three categories, taking the first one, there are a number of viewers who expressed great delight in these images, intrigued by the way they looked like children, and these evoked warm impressions of childhood. One person expressed this vividly. She saw the dolls as exuberant, joyful images of childhood. They looked as if they were contemplating a bright, colourful world in her eyes. They were filled with wonder. When I mentioned that some viewers had a negative reaction to the images, she expressed surprise. The vigorous brush marks and seemingly random colour of the figures that elicited a negative, anxious reaction in some people, seeing these features as evidence of fragmentation or abuse, evoked the opposite response in this viewer. And she said that's what makes them. That's their beauty. And it's just very interesting to see how the very same image can evoke such different reactions from people. Some responses emphasized the beauty and power of the images, but included awareness of mysterious and more disturbed elements. So one viewer wrote to me afterwards, "Thank you so much. These are wonderful, compelling paintings, young Mona Lisas," she called them, with very different but equally enigmatic gazes, which I felt was a really rich response. There are quite a lot of responses, but of course I'm not going to go through each of them. Moving on from there to the monstrous doll or child. The highly appreciative responses stand in marked contrast to those who saw the dolls in a disturbing light. And I use the overall category of monstrous to describe these viewers' reactions. I considered using the word evil, but this felt too archaic with its connotations of original evil. The actual words that people used were strange, sinister, frightening, spooky, creepy, scary, ghostly, horrible, and even terrifying. Words that pick up directly on the unnerving impact on people. These responses surprised me, as I had not previously myself regarded dolls as frightening. And I had no conscious sense of wanting to paint sinister figures. But the frequency of the association was undeniable. People who saw the dolls this way were adamant that this is what the dolls represented. So much so that a number of people could not bear to look at them. One young woman on arrival at the exhibition had an immediate negative reaction. She associated the dolls with horror films, and particularly a movie called Annabelle. And she cringed on seeing the first few and shrank as she looked round the collection. Not long afterwards, she said, "I must go," and she fled down the stairs. Another person, in fact, a friend of mine who was familiar with my painting, arrived, went upstairs to the exhibition, and almost immediately came down again saying, "I'm sorry, I just can't stand looking at them. They are just too creepy." These viewers often linked their aversion to the eyes of the dolls that they saw as blank, staring, or threatening. This was in total contrast to those who perceived vulnerability and sadness in the eyes and regarded this feature as part of the appeal and charm of the paintings. So here she comes, Vicky is her name. Now she was one of the paintings that were most frequently seen as frightening, if not terrifying. She's called Vicky and is one of the larger paintings in the exhibition, the size possibly adding to the sense of threat. I myself had seen Vicky as a cute, wide-eyed kid, maybe a bit surprised by the world around her, but others saw her as really frightened and frightening. There's a further aspect of the dolls seen in a negative light that might belong to the category of the monstrous. It's about the dolls as needy, very needy. Again, this was very difficult for people to deal with. "I can't stand them," one woman said. "They seem to want something from me, and I have nothing to give them. They're demanding something, and it makes me want to pull back." It was as if there was a monstrous need in the doll or the child, a frightening hunger that repelled the viewer. Yeah. The last category is the traumatized doll or child. Some of these responses were really quite disturbing. And there were two rather different strands. The first one was the doll as lost, rejected, or abandoned. And the second one was the dolls as abused physically or emotionally. Dolls stroke children. Now, the theme of abuse was striking, vividly expressed. At an early point at the preview of the exhibition, one viewer spent some time looking at the paintings, expressing a growing unease. Finally, when he came to the painting of a boy doll, Johnny, he came to this painting and he said, "I know what it is. They have been abused. You can see it in his face. His red cheeks look as if he's been slapped, and the red line across his neck looks like his throat has been cut." Can you see all that? Another person saw abuse from practically the first moment she encountered the paintings. And she ended up saying, "There's so much of this around, the abuse. I see it here too. What made you paint abused children?" I didn't know what to say, but I felt so kind of put on the spot, and she was so sure that they were abused. The other strand of perceptions in this category emphasized loss and abandonment, and the narrative took different forms. One very expressive response described the dolls as having once had a place, a meaning, a significance that was now lost. They had belonged to a child or a family, had been loved and looked after, but had since been discarded. Now they were lost in time. They had no place, and you could see it in their shabby dress, their mournful expressions. Time was cruel to them, and this viewer found the doll's plight unbearably sad. And sadness, grief, and longing were prevailing themes in people's responses. Okay, so how are we doing for time? I think I'm going to cut out a bit because time is getting short. Now, I want to talk about the group that I held. And the exhibition culminated in this large gathering of colleagues and friends in my studio, as I said, surrounded by the doll paintings. There were about 35 people, mainly psychotherapists. The group had an explicit purpose to discuss the impact of the paintings and what this triggered in them. I was very curious. I had heard the views of the largely lay public in the preceding weeks. How would the psychotherapists compare? The psychotherapist group was more open about gender issues, or more up for discussing them, than I found in other viewers. It might have helped that I spoke about my own relationship to dolls as a child, and how being a boy in repressive apartheid South Africa, I did have an early interest in dolls, but became anxious about this, sensing that this wasn't the right thing for a nice Jewish little boy to do, white little boy in this country, and then avoiding dolls. Now, I think it was possibly my openness about this that enabled other people to talk about gender issues. And the group quite soon got in touch with some of these concerns and discussed the imposition of gender stereotypes, confirming the prevailing norms of the last century and the long-standing social constraints on children of both sexes. Of course, comparisons could be made with the current greater social tolerance of gender fluidity. And interestingly, I also found gender-based differences in communication styles in this group. The men, I found, approached the dolls theme in a more reserved way. One or two initiated intellectual discussions about dolls. What was the definition of doll? What was its derivation? The question prompted several men there and then to Google the word doll, and a discussion ensued. Now, it was a useful and a valid contribution, but I felt that it tended to dampen the emotional resonance created by the paintings. The women in the group, by contrast, told emotionally laden stories about their relationship to dolls and expressed more direct feelings in the discussion. An important theme described the dolls' paintings as excavating aspects of lost or repressed childhood. This aspect I found was especially rich, perhaps reflecting therapists' interest in early development and their inclination to talk openly about their own childhoods. Someone used the word revivification. It's a word I find difficult to pronounce, but it's from revivify, and the noun is reviviki. Can anyone else pronounce this? You know what I mean. But it's the sense of reviving, reanimating the dead or the disappeared, forgotten years, forgotten selves, forgotten toys. These came to life in the discussion. Now, perhaps the most vivid example of this was given by a colleague who grew up in Germany in the aftermath of World War II. This is someone who, like others, has given me permission to talk about her response and not to feel worried about confidentiality. But I found this a very haunting response. She described how, as a child, she would wrap her dolls in cloth or newspaper, then bury them in the garden. Did I mention that she grew up in Germany after World War II? Some months after burying the dolls, she would exhume the doll and unwrap it to see what effect the burial had on them. She wanted to see how the doll had fared, what damage it had sustained, whether it had survived. And although she did not speak about the war or the post-war context for that matter, it was difficult not to consider the doll's burial as a symbolic representation. Burials on a wide scale were a feature of the war, the mass graves, people buried dead, alive or half alive, and the exhumation of the dead at the termination of the war revealed the dreadful evidence of how many people had been slaughtered. Was this a child's innocent attempt, probably unconscious, to grasp the horror of what had happened in the war and to fathom the devastation on real lives? I actually sent this paper to her, and she said she agreed with everything I'd said. She felt that I'd really summed up her experience and that it wasn't unconscious, it was conscious. She was very conscious of what had happened in the war. Her parents didn't talk about it, and she wanted to find out more about it, and it seems as if this was a symbolic way of exploring those issues. This example of the burial of the dolls illustrates the point about revivification, the bringing alive of the dead that I mentioned. It touches on the process of mourning that is a requisite for dealing with loss. The repeated return of the lost object as a way of gradually mourning the loss, the process so brilliantly described by Freud in his paper Mourning and Melancholia, where you probably know that he links depression to mourning, failed mourning, which is prompted by guilt about ambivalence about the lost object, and a turning of anger against the self, which is the source of the depression. Now, a striking aspect of the discussion was the degree of projection onto the dolls. Projection was clearly evident in the public responses that preceded this discussion. I wondered whether the therapist group, there would be a greater consciousness of projection, a recognition of the force of subjectivity, and an attempt to address and understand these projections. This seemed, I have to say, not to be the case. The projections came thick and fast. They had the effect of concretizing the images, and it was as if people assumed that what they were seeing in the dolls were intrinsic qualities of the dolls. They seemed to lack an as-if quality in some cases. And at one point, a non-therapist member of the group commented, "Don't you realize that these are projections? These are rather sweet, pretty dolls." And another person said, "I think that the dolls aren't one thing or another. Everything you're saying is being put onto the dolls." But the projections came in, and these are damaged dolls. They have been abused. They are definitely lost. They are sinister, and so on. This was undoubtedly a powerful discussion, and it had the effect on me of rethinking the reasons for my painting the dolls. The theme of loss and mourning and the there's that word again, the revivification of the past particularly got to me, and I will say a little bit more about this in due course. But I want to end this description of the group by highlighting what a rich and stimulating event it was, illustrating the power of visual images to mobilize group reflection and debate. Now, what did I learn for myself? As I said, the weeks of feedback about the painting put me in touch with aspects of my motivation for producing this series that I had not realized before. The predominant personal theme that I now realized was integral to the paintings and for me was loss. I do not have time to explore this in detail, but I became aware that dealing with loss had been a preoccupation of mine in the last few years. At age 75, I had become acutely aware of the passing of time and the loss of youth, echoed over and over by the loss of loved ones, family and friends. I'd felt overwhelmed by loss. This had triggered memories of earlier loss. This is what came to me towards the end of this exhibition. Memories of earlier loss in my family came up very vividly. My mother's loss of children through stillbirth that was never communicated or explained, but more so, the unspoken and unmarked loss of my father's family in the Holocaust. He lost most of his family in the Holocaust, and he emigrated from Eastern Europe to South Africa. The silence in particular had cast a shadow over my family. This had never been discussed until well into my adulthood, when I challenged my father about his silence, and he finally spoke, broken-hearted. These associations have remained with me since the exhibition ended. It was as if the paintings were an awakening, a reminder, a wake of all those absent figures. The dolls, I realized, were like the ghosts of the past, the loved ones I had known and lost, and those I never knew. As we move to the end of this talk, I want to bring back the discourse of childhood, broaden out a bit, become a bit more general from the personal, and the notion that people's responses, which were intensely personal in many cases, at the same time reflected the social construction of childhood. So the three categories I described, the lovely, monstrous, and traumatized child, are embedded in culture and played out in different ways by families and children. I'm not saying that the experiences children have are not real. Of course they're real, but different families and children may have different valences for these social messages, social assumptions, and so on, that probably operate at a largely unconscious level, even though the actual experience of childhood is, of course, intensely real and mediated by more than unconscious processes. And I'm going to round off my talk by touching base with my own field of group analysis as we understand and practice it in the UK and Europe, which is rather different from the American tradition, as you know. The contribution of the analytic founders, notably Fuchs and Anthony, was not only in delineating the core principles of group process, but in their vision of the group as transcending the ordinary and connecting with the imaginative and unconscious life of the group. James Anthony, in particular, referred to the analytic group as a magic circle, and I adopted this metaphor in my second book, The Group as an Object of Desire. John Schlapperberski, too, in his book, From the Couch to the Circle, emphasizes the value of imagery, both verbal and visual, in the evolution of the group. I've also referred to the work on the social unconscious that is heralded mainly by Earl Hopper and Chaim Weinberg. Perhaps the most exciting aspect of my dolls project was not just the convergence of my two interests, but the synergy created by their coming together, a heightened awareness of the power of visual images to enliven and deepen the group, especially when drawing on both the personal and the social. That the dolls opened a door to my lost ancestry and helped me to reclaim a forgotten aspect of my family history was an added, though painful, bonus. In sum, this was an unexpected and revelatory experience for me. Thank you for letting me share it with you. Could we have just about 5 minutes of questions or discussion, and then we're going to have a break?
I associated some of the paintings not with an abused doll, but an unrescuable, dying doll. And it made me aware of the history of dolls in my own life, that throughout the 50s, they were our babies, Raggedy Ann and even Chatty Cathy. We cared for them. And then there was a parentified doll introduced, which was Barbie. So we were caring for a parent. And it was such a different, disturbed, almost now, I was inspired by this to realize
Yes, of course, Barbie
that
was
the
an adult.
caring turned into an adult, caring for the adult.
Yeah, a rather slim, fashionable adult too.
Thank you very much, Morris. I wonder if you could say something about your experience of the actual painting of the dolls versus painting of the seascapes, what your emotional experience
Yes.
was in the activity.
Yes, that's interesting. I think I could probably talk about this for some time, but to sum it up, I think when I paint landscapes, I have a very strong, and seascapes, a very strong sense of connection with nature. And it's a sort of intuitive sense, so that I'm often influenced by the atmosphere, the feelings, and I allow a lot of latitude. I think when I painted the dolls, I was more conscious, more self-conscious in a way, perhaps because I was still struggling with why I was painting these, so that the fact that I had made this departure was on my mind. And I think I was more focused on detail and what it meant and on the symbolism. So it was a more, overall, a more conscious experience. Although I dare say there were also very subjective and intuitive aspects, as I hope I've conveyed to you.
Thank you for sharing that. I was thinking of it as the projective doll test in the Rorschach and some of the scoring. What felt very real to me was the chiaroscuro, that shading of the skin, the way the brushes, that it gives it the dimension of texture.
Yeah.
And texture in the Rorschach, right, is associated
Yes.
with anxieties, which is such a compilation
Yes.
of so many different aspects of feeling. And that's the eyes didn't bother me.
Yes.
Even, it was interesting, the closure of the skull line on many of those drawings were absent. But so I felt like the anxieties that get triggered projectively are about the shading.
Yes, yes. I've always been interested in texture in painting. I use quite thick paint. I use largely a palette knife when I paint. And texture means a lot to me. And I, in the past, used the Rorschach a great deal. And I'm very aware of texture in the Rorschach as a dimension. I was conscious of that, actually. So conscious of it, and also wanted to play it up. I wanted there to be texture. I wasn't kind of worried about people getting anxious about it, even if they did. So thank you for pointing out. The texture is very important.